Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Talking Niagara this morning with me, Peter Giblett, and him, Dave Wheeler. Morning, Dave. The world is wanting you to look up. I said, the world is wanting you to look up. You were kind of like this.
I was looking at my phone there.
Yeah. Okay, so what's been going on? What's been going on recently?
Well, we have today in our group of articles sort of how the region is kind of a microcosm of what is going on in the whole country, where there is debates about whether or not we should extend certain incentive programs to build houses that will cost the taxpayer a fair amount of money, and also a homeless encampment in St. Catharines.
We'll be talking about that.
Yeah. And then the most important thing is the state of the economy of Canada. I've heard murmurings about this for a long time, and I read an article in the Globe Mail yesterday that was really talked about what Carney can do to help Canada's economy, but basically it's a lot of very hard truths, and it really does seem that the Canadian government has sort of really mismanaged migration and its whole. It's out there. We are. And we'll get to it. Basically, Canada is losing ground very fast compared to other nations.
Yeah. All right. So first one I had up, this protection system failed to get young girl whose body was found in a Toronto dumpster. This is a few days old, but basically it's easy to kind of lay the blame, particularly on the premier for this sort of thing. But in fact, in reality, how do we make sure it never happens again? That's the biggest question, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a very, very sad thing. A young girl, and Ford is right. The child protection system failed this girl totally. This is a young guy. I think she was about 4 years old, and they found her in her decomposing body in a dumpster.
Yeah.
And Children's Services, so they took this child away from the parents early on because they didn't feel that the mother in this particular case could adequately care for the child. Of course, they're motivated to put the child back in the mother's care as soon as she gets her act back together. That's pretty typical. That's with foster parents program and all that. Is you usually like a foster parent program is a stopgap where a child can stay with stable people, foster parents for a while until their parents get themselves back in order. Sometimes that never works. The foster parent child stays for long periods of time, others for short periods of time. In this particular case, the Child Services kept putting the child back into the care, put the child back into the care of the parent with all kinds of alarm bells showing, and the child was found dead in a dumpster. She has a brother. They're going to have to get that brother and save that brother if they can. Now, the child just disappeared, and they didn't know where it was. So they were tracking it somewhat. And then they found it in a dumpster. And the child didn't have a chance.
No.
It was not adequately protected by the system. They put the child back into a problem area. And I have a little bit of experience with this. When I remember a kid that lived across the street from me was put into the foster parent care system. And although many people, some of my neighbors tried to tell the Children's Services the child was not normal and was going to be a real problem, and it should not be put into a family that did not know. And that's exactly what happened. The child was in there, became very aggressive, had been sexually abused, and tried to sexually abuse the young children of the family. The family was horrified to know
Yep.
that this child had a history of these problems and was never told about that. So there are some real problems with the child care system. I think probably in the most part, it's a good thing. But in this case, they really feel badly when this young child
Yeah.
was found in a dumpster decomposing. They had to do DNA tests on it to find out who it was.
To find out who it was. Yeah, absolutely. And that's, she fell through the cracks of this, of the of the child protection system. I was trying to say, it wasn't coming out. And, what do we need to do to make sure this never happens again?
Yeah, I don't know. You're really going to have to tighten something up.
Yeah.
Now the little 4-year-old girl had a name. It was kind of a cool name. It was Neve, which is heaven spelled backwards.
Yeah.
And it was found, and her poor little body was found in a dumpster in Rosedale. Rosedale is a high-end neighborhood, and unless something's happened since I knew about Toronto, Rosedale is a high-end neighborhood. Well, so that it says here, we've got to make sure it never happens again, no matter if it's a wider scope of looking at it. Unfortunately, they have rules sometimes, and sometimes the rules cannot be overcome. I bet you there was a lot of people in the child care program in this system that knew that this was a problem, and they were probably trying to oblige the rules that were already there in the system, which made it impossible for them to not let the child back into the hands of its mother. I'm very sure there were people in the child care system that were very alarmed at having this child back in the care of its mother.
The principle about putting a child back into the mother's care is a good one, but in certain circumstances, there needs to be an asterisk on the file that says never put this child back into a parent's care.
You can't do that. You can't do that. You can't put absolutes. And the mother has the parents have certain rights for their children. And it says here, Nevia's younger considered the future of Nevia's younger siblings. It was revealed her mother, who has extensive history with child protection agencies and substance abuse challenges, had likely hidden the pregnancy, and Neve had limited prenatal care. Toxicology reports at her birth revealed marijuana, prompting the Niagara Region AIDS Society the York Regional Children's AIDS Society to obtain a protection order that placed the newborn in the care of a foster family at just 5 days old. So the red lights went up right away.
Yeah.
And 4 years later, she's dead in a dumpster.
Yeah, the point being is, as I was saying, with those kids from her mother, there needs to be a flag on that file that says these as far as possible shouldn't be returned to that mother.
There are rules that they have,
and I grant there are rules. Yeah,
and that's what I'm saying. I don't think. Yeah, that would be nice if they could have a flag on it, but that is probably unconstitutional. It'd be really nice to have a flag on it and say, "Do never return these," or have. What happens is they go. What happens is they take the child, and then they have the mother visit the child under supervision, and after a while they think, "Oh well, the mother's okay again." we can now release the child into the care of the mother. We've kind of tested her out. However, you're putting the child into a very bad situation. I think I don't know. I don't know. When then in 2020, the world was looking down at COVID-19 pandemic, came reevaluation. Their protection status resulted in Nivea and her younger brother placed back in the care of the mother, but under the supervision of child welfare authorities. So how come the child welfare authorities failed?
Yeah. Right, Mike says, I've dealt with child services and can attest they are useless. Kids graduating from college are in charge of deciding families' fate when they know nothing about child rearing. And further, he says, family services need more power and they need to make sure those working for child services are competent.
I don't know. There's many unanswered questions here.
Yeah.
The New Democrat MPP Monique Taylor from Hamilton Mountains said the death of any child as being in care should automatically trigger coroner's request, and Nivea's case screams for one. I would say yes, quite definitely.
I would tend to agree. But that doesn't resolve the problem. It's an inquest about what happened. It's not so much an inquest about how to stop. It's not an inquiry about how to stop it.
Well, this may give them some kind of clue as to what they missed when they gave the child back to the parents. Yeah. Now, this woman apparently has there is at least one other brother, but I believe that the woman has other children. The immediate thing has to be that those children have to be back into children's care services immediately. There's going to be no ifs, ands, or buts about this one. Whatever other children she has are automatically at risk, and unfortunately, that's a very, very sad tale. Indeed. And I brought that up just to, because we often kind of just feel that our institutions are working like they should do. Child care services are doing what they should do. No, they probably, and I will say this too, there's probably so many rules and regulations on keeping a child away from its parents that it's probably impossible for people who know the child's going to be at risk, or potentially at risk in the system, and they'll get overlooked. They'll say because rule number 1772 says that if you cannot find if the mother's been behaving herself for 6 months, you can send the child back, etc. And like I said, with the foster parent program, it usually works fairly well because children most normally want to go back to their parents, particularly the mother. Even as bad as their mother might be, children have an attachment to their mother, and that's where they want to go back to. Even foster kids who have found who have lived with foster parents in a much nicer environment still crave their parents. That's nature. That's nature. They crave particularly their mother. And that attachment between child and mother is an incredible magnet. And so you can see the dilemma which children's services are in.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. And, I think there has to be, we have to figure out a way, and clearly you and I aren't the experts in this area, but we have to figure out a way to make sure this never happens again.
In human existence, the bond between child and mother is probably the most powerful interpersonal attachment of all, particularly when a child is young.
Well, you continue to have relations with your mother more than father, because often if the mother and father split, people have a long-term relations with their mother, and when the father often splits, the father's no longer in the picture.
My
Even though the father's
my
still
kids see
alive.
their mother way more than they see me.
Yeah,
and I just know that it's natural,
And it's not because you're not available. It's just because exactly it's natural, right?
Yeah, because where the mother is, that's where they're perceived their old home was,
Yeah, yeah. And this is part of the challenge we face. Okay, I hope the right people take the right steps. All right. Okay.
I will say my son just stopped by all of a sudden and gave me a smoked trout the other day. I would like some more visits like that. That was excellent.
I bet you would. Yeah, that's nice, right? Okay, so regional councillors are divided on housing incentive programs. So they are, and the challenge here, of course, is that taxpayers are always likely to take the hit, aren't they?
Yeah, this is like what's happening here is a microcosm, like I said, a bit of a microcosm of what's happening in the nation. There's an argument going on in the region whether or not to continue the incentivizing programs for developers. That is like a dollar for dollar type of thing. Whatever you spend, we spend kind of thing.
Yeah.
And to extend these things, even when they're given incentives to build and yet still haven't built, and the sunset clause is passed and they extend these things. Cisco makes the argument that developers will not develop affordable properties unless they're incentivized. And we've talked about this continually on this show. And a developer, if he's got a bunch of land, is going to go for the high-end market. He's going to build houses that way.
Yeah.
Now, what the region is saying is that if it doesn't incentivize builders to build affordable units, basically, that they won't. And you have to incentivize that.
Exactly. And for example, whether it's an apartment has a cost factor to making it, a house has a cost factor to building it, and developers want to make a profit out of that whole system. And if you're basically saying, you can't make a profit because you've got to build it for for low income people, then you've got to give an incentive to make that happen. I get that.
Now the program is known by acronyms SNIP, which stands for Smarter Niagara Incentive Program, TIG, Tax Incentive Grants, and BTIG, Brownfield Tax Incremental Grants, are matching fund programs with local municipalities and the region. The approved extensions also apply to Smart Growth Regional Development. No acronym there. It would have been but it's Smart Growth Regional Development Charge Reduction Programs. Now, councillors did pass the Cisco's motion to extend these programs from October 1st, 2027 in a 14-7 vote during last week's committee on the whole meeting. However, Fort Councillor Tim Isini in Sina, I guess, said the region doesn't have the wherewithal for this program. This is the rub here. Go ahead.
Yeah, 40 councillor's name, I think, is Tom Encina.
Yeah. Now here's the rub, and this is where it's kind of like a microcosm of Canada. We have to take on more tax as individuals in order to support these programs.
Yeah, of course we do.
And he is saying we cannot afford that. It sounds good, but we can't afford it. We're going to be dumping on the taxpayer again. This is going to make this is going to put more pressure on the average household. I think it's $50 per year or something per household. Now that's his.
I'd like to see what our own regional councillor Bob Gale has to say about that, because he's normally hot on the tail of whether we can afford it.
He's. I would assume by the way this is reading that he would have voted against it. I couldn't be sure about that, but by that,
no, it doesn't talk about. I didn't see any mention of Bob Gale, but he's normally pretty smart on the how do we manage to pay for it.
Yes, and like I said, this is a microcosm. What's going on in the nation is we are basically we are in our nation. We're trying to incentivize growth with taxpayer money in a big way. In this particular case, it's a smaller version of that. We're trying to incentivize growth with taxpayer money. Will it actually definitely work? And Encina says we cannot afford this. We're going to nickel and dime as we go through the budget process, cutting 1,000 here or a couple of 100,000 there, when in fact we can help ourselves right now, but we're not going to. I don't understand it. He says that you could really reduce the budget surplus by discontinuing these programs. And but of course the argument is, if you discontinue them, who's going to build these places? Can the taxpayer take on another burden or more burdens like this? If this doesn't work, if the incentivizing program doesn't work, and they think, well, we have to incentivize more, we have to put more into the kitty to incentivize the builder, then it's more of a drain on the taxpayer. And if you do, and right now the problem is getting these places started. The ones that are going to start and be built are the ones that are going to return the biggest return to the developer. So if they have a piece of land, let's say a 20-acre piece of land, they're going to put high-end housing on it. Somebody comes along and says, instead of putting that high-end housing, how about putting these concentrated, intensified developments where more and more people can live on them? And the developer says, why do that? I'll make a lot more money making high-end housing. Well, here's your incentive. Here's your incentive. Here's your money. Here's what the taxpayers are going to do for you.
Well, it's an interesting thing about that. I heard a thing about three to 4 years ago about a development whereby they were looking at putting a set of houses on that was being objected to by the local community. And one of the things that was said by somebody who had some expertise in this area is that if you like, the price per acre, whether you're building a smaller home or a larger home, the price per acre that a developer gets out of their development likely remains the same. So basically what they're saying is, if you build 2 homes in a 1 acre plot, you're likely to make the same money as if you build 4 homes in a 1 acre plot, or even 12 homes in a 1 acre plot. So in fact,
so who is that? Oh, everyone else says something different. So one person says what you're saying, and other people say the opposite. So who is that expert? Well,
the thing that I was going to say that was interesting about that, though, is that where you make money on affordable housing comes about because you make like a tower block full of them.
Well, it says here that a lot of development, and this is Cisco speaking again, I think. I don't think anybody is chomping at the bit to turn the old cotton mill in Merton into a keg until CIP came around. There's an example of the old cotton mill turning into a keg and that happened because of incentive programs. A lot of development has occurred in St. Catharines on old brownfield contaminated areas that, oh boy, wouldn't I like to live there? That only happened because of CIP. The regional staff report costs associated with extending the programs will have significant impact on Niagara's annual budget, and that the extension will continue to increase to the Niagara taxpayer. So there's the rub. The report said, based on the forecast of local municipalities, it will cost at least $16.2 million to cover the grants.
Yep.
Now you have the two sides of it. We can't afford this. The taxpayer can't be burdened any longer. This is one argument, and the other argument is if we don't incentivize these things, it won't get built.
Yeah.
Obviously, 14 out of the 21 votes thought that it would work, keep going. But Cisco's one of these kind of guys, I have a feeling, that doesn't care too much about how much the tax go and how much we have to borrow. Look at the state of his city; it's hugely in debt, and that is still, like I say, a microcosm of what is happening in Canada. You can't keep borrowing.
To be fair to Matt Cisco, and I don't know what the debt situation is like, but Mr. Cisco only became mayor in 22. And he was not mayor prior to that, but I know he was a city councillor, and he was a regional councillor prior to that. So to what extent we can blame Mayor Cisco for the debt in his city, I'm not sure.
I don't know. I've read some things that he said and some proposals that he's had. I didn't really like them at all, but I thought they would be they were wrong anyway. This is a good quote here, though. Everybody keeps talking about affordable housing, which is true. Cisco said, "I'm going to say this loudly for the people in the back. Affordable housing is not built by private industry. It's not. This is a myth that we tell ourselves. Affordable housing, by the definition we have, is going to get built by cities, and it's going to cost us a lot more money than we want. And we need market rate rents because there are people right now in our rent geared to income units that are paying essentially market rents and have nowhere to go."
Well,
this is an important point.
In a way, he's right, because if you look at Europe, where back in the 50s and 60s they built the municipal housing projects that they built, they're built by the city. They're built not by private industry. Yeah, they may have been contractors that were engaged by the city, but they were city housing, city plans, city developers that built those housing.
Yeah, and then in this case here, he's also saying that it's important to say that there's rent geared income, people living in units of rent geared income that should be transitioning to an affordable home if there was one available for them.
But there's none.
That rent-geared income unit that they're living in should actually go to someone who is much poorer, basically, and needs a place to stay. But the people who are in there now are able now to transition to what would be an affordable home from a people who can't afford homes, a highly subsidized home, to one that is an affordable unit, can't find one. So that rent-to-geared income unit should be vacated so that someone else in more dire straits can go there. But
and what needs to happen is
because there's nothing available for them.
Yeah, so what needs to happen is needs to be a transition from rent geared to income for the poorest members of our community to so-called market rents through Niagara Regional Housing. But then there needs to be a next step where do they go to from there, which is essentially more affordable than the true market rate.
Now here's the final wrap up of it, the final quote. If the last actually paragraph of the article, if we don't extend these programs, we're putting at risk 1,400 units that have largely gone through the process but can't get to a shovel-ready situation by the end of this month. They just can't. And that is happening everywhere anyway.
That is.
Shovels aren't getting into the ground. Yeah, only those ones that are going to return a profit the fastest are the ones that are being built.
Okay, so Mike basically makes 2 points. The government must step in and regulate real estate. We need a crash and a correction of the real estate prices. Yeah, well, I understand where you're coming from. How much longer should we watch it happen? What is happening? We need to act. We need real estate crash again, right?
Well, here's a fact that we don't normally hear, and one of the things that have been helping the federal government with its tax revenue is high prices for housing. For a time there, the Liberal government was not incentivized to help reduce the high prices of real estate because they made money through taxes from this. Yeah. The inflated houses, somehow the inflated houses and taxes that do bear down on them, somehow filtered back into the government and inflated that part of their treasury. So they weren't really, at first, until it became a real issue, too incentivized to step in and make sure that real estate prices went down.
All right. Moving on, Canada's getting poorer when compared to its wealthy peers.
Well, we should actually go to the Fairview. Well, how much time we have left? Well, I would just like to talk about a sort of an addendum to that whole thing, and that was the Fairview Park rejuvenation won't proceed until housing encampment is addressed.
Yeah, I know.
Now, while we're talking about this, now we go to the very, very bottom of our socioeconomic population. Also on the bill for in St. Catharines, and this particular is St. Catharines, is a $12 million makeover of a park, Fairview Park in St. Catharines. And
once the homeless have gone.
That's right. Now, the City of St. Catharines Council has approved this, and it's the money is set aside for it, and it's going to be really nice. There's going to be multi-use tennis courts, splash pad, new playground, washrooms, gardens, all these kind of, and a heritage trail, observation deck, commemorate historical aspects of the property that was once part of the Third Welland Canal. However, it can't happen. Why can't it happen, Peter?
Because there are homeless encampments on the land, as there are pretty well in almost any public property nowadays.
So here's this wonderful park that's going to be built, but it can't be built because the homeless are there, and we know by the judges' rulings on these that happened in London, you cannot clear them out unless you can accommodate their population in some other way.
Yeah.
If you cannot find places for these people to live, then you can't push them off the places they are living, because they have rights. They have rights of existence. You can't say, well, you got to leave here and go to a shanty town outside of town. You're living there, and we can't force you out of there. And how are you gonna build a nice park? And who's going to come to the nice park after you build it when it's full of homeless people?
Yeah.
So there's the real rub, and that's another sort of microcosm of what's happening in Canada now. There is this growing and growing Unterklasse, this socioeconomic layer underneath that keeps growing, and what we can't deal with. The Catharines can't deal with this. Okay, go ahead.
I didn't say anything.
Oh, I thought you were about to chime
No,
in.
I was thinking that, you know, and this, if you like, is a part of where it comes back to, feeds into Canada's relatively weak economic growth. All right, because the homelessness and that weak economic growth is meaning, you know, typically, if you look back in history, homelessness declines when you get an improvement in the economy, when you get an economy that's growing ahead. Now, with our weak economy, I don't even know you can say it's economic growth, right? Not convinced. You know, whilst there are some growth, you know, I think there's as many negatives as there are positives.
Yeah. I think this is, like I said, it's just a kind of a microcosm of what's happening in Canada, is what's happening in the region, in our cities in and around the region here. You have this growing group of the Unterklasse, the untouchables, basically, that live in tents, and we can't seem to fix that. And that has to do with, like you said, a sick economy, or an economy that's in decline. Now, of course, the other objection to this big park is something that, aside from the homeless, and this is kind of interesting, is actually kind of a side. One of the councillors, Williamson, who voted against the motion, said he'd also like to see more natural areas preserved, adding the city has lost a lot of its green space. I would have preferred to see a park that has a lot less hard surfaces. There are lots of good attempts to do things here, but the hard surfaces are the enemy of biodiversity and a naturalized space. Now, that is a very good point. When you make a park like that, what do you want to do? You want to preserve the green spaces, so you get out there, or tarmac it up with tennis courts and lots of fancy playthings.
And that's a fair question.
Maybe the people just want to walk through a green space.
Yeah, and that's a fair question, because if you've got a park, some parkland, and it's, say, less than 10 acres in size, then probably the answer is yes, you want to preserve the green space in it, keep it as natural as possible, because it brings people in close proximity to a little taste of nature. But when you've got a park that may be 50, 100 acres in size, then there's always room for the tennis courts in one corner of it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that is what Williams' suggestions was. Parking concerns are another problem.
Of course.
Once you put a lot of attractions into a park, you're definitely gonna attract more people. More people means you need a big parking lot, and there you do cut into some green space.
And the irony, of course, is that the park, I remember as a kid, we used to have in walking distance a park. We used to go play. We used to have some climbing frames on, swings on. We used to play football there. And that park was in walking distance for home for all the kids in our neighborhood. There was nowhere to park for that park, because it was a local park. It didn't have tennis courts. So of course nobody would be going and going and playing tennis, paying to play tennis. And what we had, we put jumpers out as the goalposts for our football pitch.
That's what I did too. Like, we would go to parks. We had huge parks. The one thing they did do for us, put big rinks in the wintertime. But aside from that, it was just a big wide open space. We had the old apple trees that used to be there, a big long row of pine trees, but basically huge fields. So we'd set up. There was a big stone in the field, and we used that for home base. Because it was sunk in. It was only up this much, but it went deep into the ground. So that was our home base, and we'd pace out our bases. We'd also played massive football games there. I mean, not 12 aside, like 24, 30 guys aside, playing this massive, more like murder ball.
When you're a kid, you don't care about. When you're a kid, you don't care about the rules of 11 players aside. You just, hey, Joe's on my team.
Canadian football, actually, you do have 12, but
I know, but yeah. I was talking soccer football, but yeah, the same point anyway. But in kids football, you don't bother about how many players are on each side, and often you're playing with 6 players on each side, or 15 players on each side. Depends who shows on the day.
Yeah. Now I'd like to go over to
that was all about local space, and the question about to go back to Canada's economic growth is a fair question. It really isn't it?
Yeah, so there is a couple of articles I've been reading. Now, this has been a long time coming, and this is really the crux of the show, basically. Our economy is in a terrible condition. We are losing ground. Now, of course, we always hear we're losing ground against our neighbor to the south, but we are also losing ground against compared to peer nations like Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom.
Well, we're a bigger... we probably, size-wise, population-wise, we don't compete with the UK. We're certainly bigger than both Australia and New Zealand, so we should be more economically powerful than both Australia and New Zealand. In fact, New Zealand has typically had in the latter half of the 20th century a big problem about its best people leaving.
Well, that's happening in Canada right now. And it's also happening that our industries are not reinvesting in themselves because of the tax burden and the expectation that they might pick up routes and head to the south or into the United States, because the incentive for growth and technology is much better there. And the wealth gap between the Canada and the U.S. obviously has grown wider, according to published organizations for economic. In other words, the wealth gap that used to be pretty much in lockstep with the United States, the wealth gap has grown more and more and more. We have basically, because of our and one of the main reasons for this, because of our rapid inflated immigration process in all areas, full-time residents, students, and temporary workers, has made the pie smaller for more people. That's normally when you speak of economics, you thinking of a pie is usually not a good idea, because it brings about the idea that there is only a pie and it's only so big, and the more people taken out of it, the less pieces everybody gets. But what the pie should be doing in Canada is growing. So the pie gets bigger, more people get the same slice of pie as the pie grows. What we find here is the pie is shrinking. The pie is shrinking and the people are more. You have more people trying to dip into the wealth of Canada than Canada can sustain.
And pure mathematics says that, if you had 1.7% of the pie 10 years ago, you've got 0.6% of the pie now because of the increase in population.
Now, Canada's relatively weak economic growth, combined with population boom, has hit its standing among wealthy nations.
Yep.
It's one reason why Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has turned to former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney to give him the cabinet advice on how to juice the economic growth. However, the lackluster, and it says the Treasury Board President Anita Anand is also launching what she calls working group to study the country's lackluster productivity to find ways to boost economic output. But the problem is the government has put itself in the deepest of holes by the policies of which it has conducted itself for the last 10 years. Chrystia Freeland, when the U.S. economy's when the U.S. economy grew 3 quarters in a row and we lagged behind, Chrystia Freeland says, "Oh well, that's just an anomaly. That's going to correct itself." It's happened 2 more times. It's happened 2 more times.
Well, and the worst of this, Dave, is you can point in our recent past to poor performances of some great or formerly great Canadian companies that used to be at one point world leading and are now not. And the point being is that and it's not just this particular government that this has happened under, but the prior Harper government as well.
Yes, unfortunately, the Liberals are going to have to hear some uncomfortable truths.
Absolutely.
And this I'm referring to a Globe and Mail article. It did a much better job than that article I posted, but I can't post the Globe and Mail because you wouldn't be able to open it. Yeah. And it says here, it sounds great. And it goes off, the banking governor would come up with new ideas for jobs and growth ahead of next year's expected federal election. So that's the whole idea of having Mark Carney come and speak to them. But it sounds great, except for one small hitch. Dealing with Canada's economic woes requires a near complete break with current Liberal orthodoxy of raising taxes, soaring spending, big deficits, pricey industrial subsidies. A real program for revitalizing Canada's economy surely starts with acknowledging the root problem, a continuing and worsening slide in productivity. How often have we brought that up? That's
been something of a recurring theme, right? We've talked about that a number of times, and productivity is on the slide in Canada. We know that. We've seen the statistics, and we've talked about the statistics numerous times.
Here's another telling paragraph. The latest Statistics Canada data on the second quarter economic growth are sobering. Real gross domestic product per capita fell for the 5th quarter in a row. That's what I was talking about before.
Yeah.
In the spring, when the streak was just 3 consecutive quarters, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's budget shrugged it off as largely temporary, not systemic, problem that would be fixed. Carney, who in fairness did criticize the budget for failing to focus enough on growth, that's it, could do great service for the Liberals, not to mention Canada, by making it clear that failing real GDP per capita is a real problem. So that means per capita. That means we're getting less. And our standard of living is going down.
And the important point about this, and you're talking about per capita, and this is where the per capita comes into play. The country added nearly 1.3 million people last year.
That's the big that almost every one of these analysis points to the irresponsible immigration policies of the Liberals. They way overdid it.
Yeah.
I don't know why. And they came up with this idea. Well, your economy is going to grow if your population is going to grow. So immigration is very important for Canada because we don't have babies here, right? Or very few. So immigration is very important for the growth of the country. And for a little while, that helped our country maintain its its GDP. However, they way overdid it. Now there's not enough room, and you've got like 1.3 million people came in last year. How can you sustain that? You don't have houses, you don't have healthcare,
No, we
and
don't.
there is this press. And once they brought in temporary the students and temporary workers, foreign workers, that put an additional strain on it because now the employers like that. I read a book, or tried to read a book by Thomas Piketty called Capitalism or something like that, and it reviewed that. And what it kept, I only read half it. I mean, it's a book like about this, and I had to keep taking notes because my economic, my economy side of my brain is not well developed. But the basic thing was there is a constant tendency in capitalism to shift to cheap labor, and it goes right back to the slave days, and why, even though putting slaves out in the field were essentially inefficient compared to paid workers, it still paid them off. So cheap labor is one of the things that grow an economy for rich people, but it starts this gap going on, and that's essentially
there's even a cost. There's always a cost for slaves because, as with a slave, as with anybody else, you still have to pay. You still have to pay to feed them.
You have to feed them, and you have to take care of them, because the last thing you want to do is a huge investment.
Yeah, you don't want. It's a huge investment. You don't want unhealthy slaves. Not that we support the slave economy.
Say around 1850 in the United States, if someone wanted to buy a slave, a male working slave for the fields, it would cost $50,000. So how many people were able to afford them?
And you think about
you couldn't get away with just one slave; you needed a few. So if slavery was still current here, you'd have a few places. Most households wouldn't have a slave. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, exactly, and exactly. So $50,000 in the 1850s. That's a heck of a lot of money, right?
Yeah, and it says here, a report released Thursday by Toronto Dominion Bank lays out the stakes. Living standards, as measured by real GDP per capita, were lower in 2023 than 2014.
Yeah.
Yeah, seriously, that's nearly 10 years apart, and you could see here's 2014 and the decline. The bank doesn't state obvious political conclusions, but here it is. Canadian living standards have fallen under the 9 years of Liberal rule. Indictments of economic policy don't get much sharper than that. The consequence of failing to reverse this slide are unpalatable. In other words, it says that they see it. They didn't want to see what they were seeing. They had this immigration policy that should have been probably maybe only 60% of what it was, but they kept pushing it and ignoring the economic consequences. As we see, Chrystia Freeland said, "Oh, it's only an anomaly, 3/4, and then 2 more quarters of reduced productivity, and 2 more after that." Yeah, we're in a bad situation, very bad situation. This has been warned about by economists for a very long time, that Canada's economy is going. Another thing that's happening is Canadians are heading south. Like most of our talent now is going south, and the idea of having more of a capital gains tax to 66 will motivate even more people to go there. So what they're doing is they're trying to get taxes. They're trying to increase taxes to pay their bills for the programs they have, because they couldn't pay for it otherwise. They're getting more and more in debt. But when they do that, they de-incentivize people for investment here.
Yeah, and basically, where was it? Yeah, relative to other countries, we're getting collectively poorer. And it's not only relative to the US, it's relative to a lot of other countries. And hey, we've become a lot in large part the laughing stock economically of the Western world, and we've had some pretty powerful industries in Canada, and where are they now? We've had some pretty powerful corporations, pretty world leading corporations that are now no longer with us.
Well, as far as the big industries are concerned, even small industries are saying it's not worth investing in what I have here. It's not worth investing in growing what I have here because of the economic situation that's in this country. The the big problem is that people are moving here. Even our immigrants, new immigrants, the best talent of our new immigrants are moving into the States because of the standard of living is higher there, and the return for their efforts is larger. So you have a bunch of people. Let's say they come from China or South Asia, the Indians and whatever. They come here, they establish themselves. They say, well, now that I'm established and I can prove who I am, I can go to the States and they'll welcome me there because I'm the kind of immigrant they want. The other, and this is curious too, even our refugees that have come into Canada from all over the world are now turning around and going back into the United States. So the ones that escaped into Canada from the United States are finding ways of going back. As a matter of fact, and around Roxham Road, they have the reverse problem that they had before. With all these refugees coming across the border, the U.S. border guards are saying, like, there are thousands of more people than ever coming the other way, which means even the refugees see their opportunities better suited down once they take advantage of ours, and once they feel comfortable enough, they make the trek back into the States. So not only do we have our best talent going down there, we also have refugees figuring, well, it's not worth it staying here. We'll go back down to the States. I mean, I think there was like 60 people, or I can't remember the numbers. I think it's like 3,000. Like it's hundreds of times more than it used to be going into the United States from Canada in the same area which those refugees came into Canada. I mean, if our refugees are escaping, what's that tell us about the rest of us?
Okay, so final article for today. Pierre Poilievre says he will trigger a non-confidence vote at the earliest opportunity.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Depending on Singh hasn't guaranteed that he will. He won't back the Liberals on the next confidence votes. But he says it depends on what it is.
Yeah.
Now the Bloc Québécois, or the Bloc, have, of course, as we've said, you know what? We'll be your escort, but we're a high maintenance escort Liberal Party, and this is the list of things we want if we want to keep you in power. Now the Liberals may take that deal if they feel they're unprepared for an election, and definitely they are unprepared for an election.
Oh yeah,
because they're way behind in the polls.
But again, at the current point, even if and of course he doesn't, even if Mr. Trudeau had the opportunity to push back the election for another 3 or 4 years, he wouldn't close that gap on the Conservatives.
Some analysts have said that it can't be resisted much longer than into the winter, January, February, March. In there, sooner or later, the government will collapse.
I would agree. I agree with that analysis. That at some point, we will get an election triggered. And right now, if they trigger an election, we're talking about a November election or a December election. If we trigger one in October, we're talking about a January election. Or November, we're talking probably of a February election. So those are not the good times to have elections.
Yeah, and the Liberals are going to a retreat, and they've invited Mark Carney to magically save them. That's way too little, way too late. They ignored these things way too long, pretended they weren't happening, and now it may be impossible to change the leader of the Liberal Party at this particular time either. If the election was going to go all the way to October next year, they may have had a time to transition leaders. Now, if they trigger a vote, they won't be able to, and
Yeah,
that's exactly what the Conservatives want, because they
yeah,
don't want the Liberals to put in a party leader that might be a little more popular than Trudeau. They want an unpopular leader, and they want an unpopular government, and
yeah.
that
Oh, yeah.
suits their purposes. Cool, but if they put Mark Carney in, and he looks like the rising star, the big blue wave may not
Well,
be as big as it looks like
yeah,
now.
and typically the poll lead, which is about 20% right now, typically that poll lead will narrow by 5 or 6% in the direction of the government, and at the 20%, it would look like a landslide for the Conservatives, but there would be even there. If the election were to be held now at that 20%, there'd be areas whereby the Liberals would maintain and keep certain seats, which they would not be expected to keep.
They'd have to change their leader, and as I said before, if they change their leader, they may be able to staunch some of the flow. They can't.
True.
The wave is going to be horrendous, and there's a couple of by-elections coming up too, which are telling, and
Yeah.
they're a few days from now. Now, now as far as Poilievre's going, Poilievre's got everything going his own way, but in a bit of irony here, him being a conservative and Kamala Harris being a Democrat in the South, Harris is very short on details and substance in her campaign, and so is Poilievre right now. So what might change things a little bit is if Poilievre he's going to have to come up with more substantive policies when the election begins. He's going to have to break with that. He hasn't really tipped his hand about what his party plans to do if they get into power. They'll have to do that in election time. And depending on how the voters view that, it may reduce his popularity as well. So that right now he's riding high because the government is so unpopular, so ineffective. It's a failed government, basically, as we can see by our economic standings. Its policies have failed. We have not worked very well, and our debt's skyrocketing, and our investment in our industries are old-fashioned. They're 1970s type investments in grants and so on. There's a whole raft of things. But Poilievre is going to have to come out and start saying what he is or isn't for, and how his party is going to change things. And whatever that is might not be that popular with the average voter. So that might reduce his popularity. Nothing
Well,
else I can see it, because they really don't have much time to change leaders.
yeah.
The Liberals are desperately need to change leaders. And
Well, one of these federal by-elections is in the Winnipeg riding of Elmwood Transcona, and this is important for the NDP because the NDP has won this 10 out of the 11 general election votes in the riding since 1988. So this is as close to safe NDP territory as we can get, and certainly if the Conservatives make a lot of progress in this election, not saying they necessarily win, but if they make progress in this by-election, that could signal bad things for the NDP.
I think the real telling one will be Verdun.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
by-election in Verdun, in Montreal area of Verdun, is going to be a Liberal NDP beast.
Yeah.
And this is one of the motivations, so it's said, that Jagmeet Singh pulled a pin on the confidence and supply agreement he had with the Liberals, because that would be a foothold in Quebec, and he can really show himself to be an alternative to the Liberals, who normally just own Quebec.
Yeah. Well,
and that would be a huge disaster the Toronto one of St. Paul was a huge disaster for the Liberals, especially when the Prime Minister went there 2 or 3 times. Chrystia Freeland and all the all-stars of the party went to that riding to drum up support, and they lost, which is a huge embarrassment. And if they lose Verdun, it's going to be an equally embarrassment. Actually, it's going to be quite a shock for them.
And actually that's an important question as well. And you see, so this actually, both these elections, it's the NDP that are actually are more on display than the Conservatives.
Yeah, in this particular case, the Conservatives are out of it. Although they're gaining more and more support in Quebec, it's going to be a long road to get some support there.
Well, part of the challenge,
what is the alternative to the Liberals in most cases in Quebec ridings are the NDP. And we knew that Jack Layton did do awesome in Quebec when he ran it.
Yeah, and he basically almost wiped out the bloc because of the fact that he could switch those bloc votes to NDP.
Well, in this particular case, Verdun is between the Liberals and the NDP.
Yeah.
And in that particular, the bloc probably wouldn't be a consideration in that particular riding because we just keep hearing this neck and neck between Liberals and NDP. And if the NDP is successful there, I think the Liberals are going to have a retreat, but they're going to have to build a wall around it because they won't want to hear what they're going to be going la 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 la. They don't want to know it.
Well, okay, so city it's basically that the Liberal is a city councillor, Laura Palestini, and the NDP is also a city councillor, Craig Suave, and I probably mispronounced that, Suave, probably, and a former political staff member will be another one, Suave, will be a former political staffer for Bloc Québécois. So
there you go. But the one thing the NDP here has an advantage of is that Quebec leans more left than most of the other provinces. It leans a little bit more left and is much more environmentally conscious than the rest of us. It will vote environmental issues where they may be secondary to the rest of us when we're considering economy and that. So if you get the NDP, they're progressive. They will lean towards to more green policies than the Liberals will. So they might really, really have a good run at it there. And it depends. The bloc may be depending on how many votes the bloc get, who they drain their votes away from, whether it's going to be NDP or Liberal. I don't know. I think whatever it is, even if the NDP are close, even if the Liberals win and the NDP are close and draw much more votes than they did previously in that riding, it still will be a warning to the Liberals, who seem not to want to know what's going on. They keep saying, well, you got to get another leader and you got to change your policies. Well, they resisted that. And now they're bringing in Mark Carney to their meeting out west. And what he's going to tell them is, you've done everything wrong. You got to change it. All these things that you've supported and say this is the way forward is the way backwards, and you got to change it all. What he's going to basically say is, you know what the Conservatives are saying you should do? Well, you got to do it.
Yep. All right. Okay. And I think we're going to have to kind of call it quits at that point, Dave.
Yes. Well, further ado, I bid you adieu. That awful, awful slaughter that's happening constantly in Gaza. I can't understand why the West can't step in there. They wiped out the safe zones. Did you see the crater? There was a tent city there. There's a crater. God, it's the size of a meteor crater. There was dozens of people killed in there. And they were after, they said, oh, well, it was a Hamas encampment. You can't drop a bomb that big and hit a small number of Hamas. You just, I mean, they are murdering dogs, and they got to stop it. And the West has got to stop them. They're a diseased society. Netanyahu is the devil's lapdog. Anyway, I can't say anymore. Pray for peace. Anyway.
All right.